Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bhavdeep Modi, and welcome to Red Lantern Analytica's concept series. Under the concept series, we'll be taking up major terms, jargon, and concepts under the international affairs domain, which are used in the literature. Over time, we have understood that international affairs literature carries with it a lot of jargon, concepts, and terms which are extremely difficult for a common layman to understand, thus limiting its reach to a wider audience. And this is the aim with which we have started this series, that we need to make the international affairs concepts, terms, and jargon more understandable so that it reaches a wider audience. And under this concept series, we're creating the first video today, which is on the topic debt trap diplomacy. Now, debt trap diplomacy as a term was coined by Brahma Chalani, who is an Indian geostrategist. He coined this term with respect to Chinese actions through extending loans to different countries and thus extracting political and economic concessions and at the same time gaining a control of their strategic interests. And in this particular regard, we can simply define debt trap diplomacy as a tactic wherein countries extend loan to another country with the negative intent of gaining control of their strategic assets, while at the same time gaining political and economic concessions. In order to understand this more simply, let's take the example of loan sharks in our general life. What do loan sharks do? They extend you a lot of loans on a higher amount of interest, or they ask you to mortgage a piece of land or any other movable or immovable property. And once you're unable to pay that to the creditor in turn takes the control of your movable or immovable property. And that is exactly what happens in debt trap diplomacy with nations. Now, in order to understand debt trap diplomacy better, we'll be talking about it through the lens of China and current Chinese actions in various countries like Pakistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, in the Indo-Pacific region, and Africa. Now, in this particular regard, let's talk about Pakistan first. The Chinese have had huge investments in Pakistan through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. As of now, Chinese side has invested close to $62 billion in the Pakistani nation through the CPEC. And under the CPEC, a lot of projects regarding infrastructure development, port development, and road linkage developments are taking place. And in order to protect the critical infrastructure that is being built through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it has been assumed and it has been slated that a total of 30,000 personnel of the People's Liberation Army shall be deployed in the Pakistani regions wherein these projects will be taken up. And in this particular regard, we also have to point out to the fact that once such an amount has been invested, this amount is extremely higher than the total amount of investments done by the United States of America in Pakistan till date, which gives China an extremely upper hand on the control and the overall influence that it carries in the Pakistani nation. In this particular aspect, we also have to throw light on the particular aspect that the Chinese also are planning to deploy its military naval assets in the Arabian Sea through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor passes through the Arabian Sea through various areas. Now, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor actually starts in Xinjiang in China and then extends to the seaport cities of Pakistan, that is Gwadar and Karachi, through various strategic areas such as the Gilgit-Baltistan area through the Khunjerab Pass, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Pass, and the Balochistan area. Now, all of these areas are, first of all, disputed lands with India. And they also carry with them a major strategic positioning, due to which they have become disputed areas between India and Pakistan. Thus, through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China will gain a lot of control over these strategic areas, thus posing a direct military and security threat to India. And this is the reason that it has been said that China has used debt trap diplomacy in order to gain influence over these strategic assets from Pakistan. And at the same time, once it passes through the Arabian Sea, we can very well assume that the Chinese will deploy its military naval assets there, thus again posing a serious security concern to the Indian nation. At the same time, it is very important to understand that in 2018, the central bank governor of Pakistan had stated that he's in fact very unclear of the Chinese investments in Pakistan, and at the same time, the amount of loans that have been given out to Pakistan. He feared that a lot of political and economic concessions will be gained by China by doling out these loans to Pakistan. And in fact, his statements were countered by a lot of officials who were part of the negotiation process of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. This clearly points out to the fact that China is indeed using debt trap diplomacy in order to gain influence over Pakistan, and at the same time using Pakistan as a means to balance India in the South Asian region. At the same time, when we talk about debt trap diplomacy of China, it is important to understand Chinese actions in the country of Sri Lanka. Now, let's talk about the Habantota port. In this particular aspect, China had earlier doled out huge amounts of loans to the Sri Lankan country. And while the Sri Lankan country was unable to pay these loans, China negotiated around the Habantota port a point wherein they gained access to the 85% of shares of the Habantota port project. At the same time, the China has gained control of a lot of port cities and ports in various countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh too. Now, if you look at the positioning of these countries are positioned in such a way that China can strategically encircle India. And at the same time, these ports, which are as of now being used for economic purposes, can in the future be militarized. Now, this particular fear emanates from the simple point that history tells us. Now, let's talk about the South China Sea and the Chinese actions there. When the Chinese started building ports in the South China Sea area and the waters, they said that they would develop these ports only for economic purposes. But later, when the South China dispute sprang up and other countries such as Taiwan, Indonesia, Philippines, Japan started staking claim to various areas under the South China Sea, that is when China slowly started to militarize their assets, their naval assets in the South China Sea. And hence, we can very well assume that this is exactly what will happen in the Indian Ocean, around the Arabian Sea, around the countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, and Djibouti, where China has already control over a lot of ports, which can now be militarized. And that is why we often say, and that is why often defense analysts and strategic analysts say that China is using its debt trap diplomacy in order to force these smaller countries such as Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Djibouti to give them access to strategic assets. At the same time, it becomes extremely important to talk about a 2018 article that came out in the New York Times. Now, this article revealed that the New York Times had gained access to a confidential plan that was hatched by China and Pakistan in order to increase their cooperation in the space domain. As per this confidential plan, China and Pakistan are aiming to weaponize the space domain, which is something that did not go down well with the Pakistani side. And in fact, China has been long accused by countries like USA, Australia, and the UK of weaponizing the space domain. But because China had doled out such huge amounts of money to Pakistan, the Pakistani side eventually had to agree to the terms and conditions put by China. And in fact, this is how debt trap diplomacy actually plays out in this entire region. At the same time, it becomes extremely important to understand debt trap diplomacy of China through the lens of the Malacca dilemma. Now, the Malacca Strait is a strategic point which serves as a major area through which China imports its energy resources from the Middle East. In fact, 80% of China's energy resources are imported through the Malacca Strait. Now, China fears in the future that countries like USA and India could blockade this particular area in times of military conflict, thereby lending a serious blow to the Chinese nation. And in order to solve this Malacca dilemma, China is also looking at extending its debt trap diplomacy to countries like Thailand. Recently, China has doled out a lot of loans to the Thailand nation. And the particular area which they're interested in are the Kra Islands of Thailand, where they're planning to build a canal. And this particular canal at Kra Islands will actually bypass the Malacca Strait, thereby solving the Malacca dilemma for China. Now, this Kra Canal will straightaway open up into the Arabian Sea waters near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which again will pose a serious threat to the Indian nation. And in this particular regard, it is important to understand that China is planning to strategically encircle India through the string of pearls tactic, which means that China is establishing its ports through the China-Pakistan economic corridor in the Arabian Sea by establishing their ports in Sri Lanka, countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh at the same time, thus encircling India and posing a serious security concern. And in this particular regard, it becomes absolutely clear that China is using debt trap diplomacy in order to gain access to these ports and other strategic assets. And it is also feared by a lot of countries like USA, Australia, UK, and India that in the future, China will also gain control of a lot of other countries to which it is rolling out loans. In the same way, China has also doled out huge amounts of loans and invested huge money in various countries of the African continent. In fact, through this very particular aspect, the Chinese are also planning to establish their first overseas military base in Africa. However, the details of the same are unclear as of now, but it can be very well assumed that China will use debt trap diplomacy in order to gain access to a lot of strategic points all across the world. Thank you and have a nice day.